It is time for the closing arguments in the case of the Florida Sheriff's deputy who was fired after a shooting incident that resulted in the death of his girlfriend. Her name is Polina Wright. His name is Leslie Boileau. Let's go in for the closing arguments.
Intentional acts with unintended results. Quite simply put, that's why we're here today. That's manslaughter. As I stand before you today, and as Mr. Buxton told you yesterday in opening statements, and as I even discussed with you Monday at jury selection, this isn't a case where we're alleging or we're going to prove to you that Leslie Boileau Jr. intended to kill Polina Wright, thought about killing Polina Wright, or killed her out of hatred, ill will, spite, or bad intent. However, what we did tell you we were going to prove, and what we did prove throughout yesterday and today, is that the defendant intentionally committed actions that led to the death of Polina Wright. As the judge has been reading instructions, and as he said, he's going to read some other instructions, one of the things that he's going to go over with you in a few minutes is a jury verdict form, and it's going to look a lot like this. Quite simply, there's two options. Either you find the defendant guilty of manslaughter, or you find him not guilty. And we're going to talk about why the state proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of manslaughter. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But when you check A, there's an additional question, which is, did the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that during the commission of the crime, the defendant personally carried, used, displayed, threatened to use, or attempted to use a firearm? And you have to check yes or no once you check A. So let's go through what exactly it is that I have to prove. And I know the judge just read it to you, but I kind of want to go through it a little bit more in detail. So to prove manslaughter, the state has to prove the following two elements. Number one, Polina Wright is dead. Well, members of the jury, that part of your job for deliberations has already been done. You heard that there was a stipulated fact that the person who unfortunately lost their life on the night of September 19, 2024 was Polina Wright. You heard from the medical examiner that Polina Wright suffered a gunshot wound to the head, succumbed to those injuries, and unfortunately passed away. Element one is not in question. However, what you do have to determine is element two. That Leslie Boileau Jr. either A, intentionally committed an act or acts that caused the death of Polina Wright, or caused the death of Polina Wright by his culpable negligence. So what does that mean? Well, as the judge read to you, in order to convict of manslaughter by act, it's not necessary for the state to prove that the defendant had an intent to cause death. Only an intent to commit an act that was not merely negligent, justified, or excusable, and which caused death. Let's talk about that for a minute. We've heard several statements from the defendant throughout his 911 call, body-worn camera, statements to Detective Kern, and even when he sat here today on the jury stand and talked to us. What was the one consistent thing he said the entire time? I was holding the gun, I pulled the trigger. He didn't slip, he didn't fall, he didn't drop the gun, he didn't accidentally pick up the gun in a way where he grabbed the trigger and made it off. What he's consistently said the entire time was, we were doing dry fire exercises. What's a dry fire exercise? That's when we fire the gun when it's unloaded. You pull the trigger, you hear it go click, and then you have to reset the trigger. What's resetting the trigger? You have to charge it. Pull that charging rod back, let the trigger reset, and pull the trigger again. What was one of the first questions I asked a member of the jury when I got up here on cross-examination? So when you had that gun in your hand and it went off, you intentionally pulled the trigger. Yes, an intentional act. That's where our job is done. I don't have to prove that he intended for that gun to go off. I don't have to prove that he intended for that bullet to hit Polina Wright and for it to kill her. It's extremely unfortunate what happened that night. I'm not disagreeing with that. And I'm not disagreeing that this was unavoidable and other decisions could have been made to where we weren't here today. But unfortunately, no matter how anybody feels about the situation or how that went down last night, does not change the circumstances of the law, the facts, and what the law requires for me to prove, and for you guys when you go back to deliberate, when you have to decide whether we proved or not. Now, I know there was some other things that the defendant wanted to say on the stand to kind of explain how things happened. And members of the jury, I'm not one to say whether I believe or don't believe certain things. That's your job to determine a witness's credibility. But as the judge talked about, things that you get to talk about or consider when weighing a witness's credibility is whether it makes sense and whether it is consistent with the other evidence that we've seen and what we've heard. And I find it interesting today that when the defendant's on the stand, he's talking about how he's trying to manipulate this gun and he's cradling it, but he's sitting and cradling it and he's trying to cock it. You get to take that firearm into the jury room. You get to look at it. You saw Ms. Killinger yesterday standing in front of you displaying how that firearm works, how that firearm operates, what you have to do to charge that firearm. You have to pull that charging rod back and let it go. Cradling it, pulling it, it's not consistent with what happened. Holding it up to your head to hear if there's a click, but shooting Polina Wright dead center in the forehead, not consistent with what the evidence was showing us. What is consistent is what he told law enforcement, what he told the 911 operator, what he told Detective Kern, and what he kind of a little bit told us tonight, or today, dry fire exercises. We heard a little bit about that training. One of the first things we do as law enforcement is we do dry fire exercises, and one of those reasons why we do dry fire exercises is practicing how to acquire a sight picture, how to aim down a gun and get our target, how to see it. When we're at the gun range doing our trainings, we take those guns, we aim right at our target. Talked about the rules of gun safety. Never point a gun at something you don't intend to shoot or destroy. Never point a gun at another person. You always point the gun at your target. That's why the red dot sight was on that night. Dry fire exercises, training exercises, looking at your target. Members of the jury, there's signs outside this courthouse. You can't bring in guns, weapons. I'm hearing you can't even bring in metal cups now. But you know what you're not prohibited from bringing in here? It's your common sense. This wasn't a situation where the defendant was pointing the gun at a wall next to Polina Wright and the bullet curves and hits her dead center in the head, goes out the exact center of the back of her head, into the wall directly behind her. Clear shot that we even see in that photo. He intentionally aimed that gun at her. He intentionally pulled that trigger. He just did not intend for the outcome to happen. That, members of the jury, is why that's manslaughter. Well, let's talk, because there's an or in there. We talked about intentional act a little bit, but there's that second one too. Culpable negligence. Culpable negligence, as I said, is every person has a duty to act reasonably towards others. If there's a violation of that duty without any conscious intent to harm, that violation is negligence. But culpable negligence is more than a failure to use ordinary care towards others. For negligence to be culpable, it must be gross and flagrant. Culpable negligence is a course of conduct showing reckless disregard of human life or a grossly careless disregard for the safety and welfare of the public. The negligent act or admission must have been committed with an utter disregard for the safety of others, and culpable negligence is consciously doing an act or following the course of conduct that the defendant knew or reasonably should have known was likely to cause death or great bodily injury. Let's talk about that. What did he tell us today? The one thing that I should have changed, the one thing I know I did wrong, we shouldn't have been sitting across from each other. Because when we're sitting across from each other and I point a gun and I intentionally pull the trigger, it might go through the person's head and into the wall in the kitchen. Because when you're sitting across from each other, there's a chance that somebody's in the line of fire. That's why I asked those questions on cross too about hot ranges and cold ranges, something that the defendant is obviously very familiar with. That when you're at a gun range, anytime anybody crosses the imaginary line that you're sitting and firing those guns, that range goes cold. Meaning that everyone has to put the guns down and lay them down. Doesn't matter whether it's the person next to you or 5 rows down stepping out in front of that line. Because there's always a concern or fear that somebody could get hit with a bullet. This wasn't a situation where he had Polina Wright slightly to his side but slightly in front of her. She was dead in front of her, doing training exercises, pointing guns at each other. And I understand. He said it today. He said it a couple times during current while it was at their general direction. But members of the jury, that's not the case. How else do we know that besides just with the evidence of the trajectory? The other thing we talked about, and specifically what Dr. Lange talked about, that injury to Polina Wright's finger. I'll be the first person to tell you, I know Mr. Taddy will probably say the same thing. No, Dr. Lange cannot tell you in any way, shape, or form what Polina Wright was doing with her hand moments before she got shot. That's a question for you guys to determine and for you guys to figure out. However, based off the circumstances, the evidence and testimony then provided, I would submit that one way is that the defendant was pointing the gun at her, and a natural reaction by most people, don't point that at me. Hey, don't point at my face. Because we know where it was aiming. Hey, don't do that. The person being taught how to safely use, own, and operate firearms was the one that night who had the common sense to go, don't point it at my face. Not the person with the years of experience, the years of training, familiarity with firearms. Let's talk about that training. I entered in a packet yesterday of the defendant's training records. It's a pretty big packet, but I kind of want to highlight a couple pages of why it was important and why I wanted to introduce that in. The first one is these are 2 pages. The first one on the left is his history from 2016 to 2020. Or I'm sorry, 2017 to 2020. The one on the right is 2020 to 2024. And what you see is the number of hours that he completes for certain titles or courses in that time frame for certain topics. On the one on the left for firearms, it's 21 hours. On the one on the right from 2020 to 2024, it's 24 and a half hours. Indicating in that 8 years that he's with law enforcement, he had over 44 hours of training, courses, classes on how to use, operate, and the general functioning of firearms. And he even told you today, not in any of those classes, trainings, studies, do they suggest, do they tell you, do they have you point firearms at other people, point firearms at people with downrange, point guns even in general directions? Because that's not safe. And we talked about his training that he did every single year. 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24. And what you see at the top of all of those are rifle qualification courses. We actually kind of heard in a roundabout way a little bit about that yesterday with Detective Kern. And when Mr. Taddy was asking him questions about rifles and how we heard him in the interview saying, I don't know much about Daniel defense guns. And Mr. Taddy asked him, is that true? And he said, I have very little familiarity with assault rifles. In fact, I'm not even issued an agency one. I don't do the training every year. But you know who did? Leslie Boileau Jr. And what's one of the things that we see every single year about halfway through on those lists when it's passed? Safety. Meaning every single year when he has to go get requalified to use an assault rifle exactly like what he shot Polina Wright with, he has to go over how to safely handle and operate a firearm. He has to go over every single year what he told us today, which is you don't point guns at each other. You don't handle guns when you've been drinking or under the influence. You don't handle guns with distractions like loud TV with football in the background. You don't handle guns with somebody who doesn't know any experience. You don't point a gun at somebody if you're not intending to shoot them or destroy them. There's one thing the defendant said today on the stand when answering one of your questions that I think sums up very best what happened that night. I'm sorry I forget the question that was asked to him. But the response he gave was, I didn't put much thought into it. That, members of the jury, is culpable negligence. Handling arguably one of the most deadly things on this planet with somebody who has little to no knowledge about it, pointing it at them, dry firing it, having live ammunition and loaded magazines on that table, playing with fire, picking up that gun, pointing it at a person, pulling the trigger, racking the gun, pulling the trigger again. And I kind of want to stop and circle on that for a minute. Because again, members of the jury, it's up for your interpretation to decide. But pay close attention to what he's talked about with Detective Kern and even kind of with his testimony, but that inconsistency. Because the way I recall it is he talks about how he was cleaning the rifle first. Polina was off doing other things. He was cleaning the rifle. She wanted to see parts. He's showing her parts, puts it back together. They start dry firing that rifle. They're done with it. He was going to put it away. She grabs the gun. He grabs the rifle again, loads it. But then when Mr. Taddy today asked him, well, how did the gun go off? Well, I had just put it back together and I wanted to make sure it was operating and I wanted to hear that clip. So was it that you cleaned the gun, had dry fired it multiple times, heard the click every time, pulled the charging rod back every single time, hearing the gun and feeling that trigger reset, pulling it, and then forgot you put a loaded magazine in it? Or is it what we just heard for the first time today, that that gun had never been dry fired until he actually discharged it and shot Polina Wright? You get to make that determination. But members of the jury, at the end of it all, you don't even have to just take my word for it that it's culpable negligence. We heard it from the defendant multiple times throughout the 911 call, throughout the body-worn camera. I'm going to have you listen one more time.
All right, we're going to hit a break right here. We're pausing it. Don't go anywhere. The closing arguments continue in the case against this defendant who used to serve as a sheriff's deputy.
4 dead students.
None of it seemed to make any sense.
He was evil.
What devastation.
All I can do is scream.
Victim to Verdict with Ted Rowlands. New episode Saturday night, 8 Eastern and Pacific.
Only on Court TV.
Interview with a Killer. New season premieres Saturday, October 25th. Only on Court TV.
Welcome back to Court TV Live. Let's go back into the courtroom now. We're watching the rest of the state's closing argument, and you're going to see the start of the defenses here as well.
That, members of the jury, is a negligent act or omission that was committed with an utter disregard for the safety of others. That's doing conduct that the defendant knew or reasonably should have known could have caused great bodily harm or death of Polina Wright, but did those actions anyways. That was one of the questions that you members of the jury asked the defendant on the stand. That's your answer. The defendant knew the potential outcome, the potential results, and he did it anyways. That, members of the jury, is culpable negligence. That, members of the jury, is why when you go back in that jury verdict room and you get that jury verdict form, you're going to find the defendant guilty. And you're going to find that during that act of manslaughter that he did actually possess a firearm. Because that's what the evidence supports, what justice demands, and what the law requires. Thank you.